Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Thank you for tuning in yet again for another edition of the Talking Books and Stuffs podcast. Today with us we have from the California area, Southern California, I assume, Doug Kari, who is a true crime author and journalist. And Doug, today we're going to talk about the Berman Murders. Is that right?
Sounds good. I'm here to talk about the Berman Murders.
Okay, so let's start off. This case is fascinating. At daybreak on January 6, 1986, a couple on a camping trip in the Mojave Desert set out for a stroll, and they never returned. So those were the Bermans. So who were the Bermans?
Barry and Louise Berman, Dennis, were two fascinating people, which is part of why I became so obsessed about this case. On the surface, they appeared to be unassuming, hippie types, but actually both had fascinating and very different backgrounds. Let's start with Louise Berman. She was born first, and she was actually 17 years older than Barry. She had come from a working class background in East Los Angeles, and kind of a difficult childhood. Well, more than kind of a difficult childhood, Dennis, because her mother was a serial philanderer, for lack of a better term, a woman who had a lot of men in her life, husbands, lovers, whatever. And one of the husbands apparently molested Louise when she was young. So she was a survivor of childhood abuse and got married early. Barry was actually her fourth husband. By the time she met him, she'd been through a wild child phase in the 60s, all kinds of partying and drug use. Barry, completely different kind of guy, very quiet, thoughtful, methodical. He grew up under fabulously wealthy circumstances in Beverly Hills. His father, Jules Berman, was the man behind the Kahlua liquor, the Kahlua brand.
Right, and everybody's heard about Kahlua, that's for sure.
Of course, and Barry grew up in a household with servants more than parental love, and he had every kind of material possession he could ever want, but that's not really what he wanted. And from an early time in his life, he was looking for something different, looking for something more. He was a seeker from the time he was just a young man. Eventually, Barry and Louise got together, really very different people coming together, becoming lovers, and then getting married.
And they became sort of yoga-type enthusiasts and more so than most people?
Definitely. When Barry graduated from high school, he went on a seeker's journey that took him around the world, and ultimately he crossed into northern India, and he ended up in Punjab province at a large ashram and became ultimately the disciple of a Punjabi guru named Charan Singh, who at that time, very charismatic guy, had millions of followers around the world. And ultimately that's what led him to Louise, because after she got past that wild child phase and became centered again, what brought her to a sense of being centered was her discovery of transcendental meditation and also becoming a devotee of Charan Singh.
So they weren't short on cash, I take it, after Louise and Barry got married. I just have sort of a digression here. Barry grew up, he's kind of like in the 60s and early 70s. Did he ever get drafted?
No. I don't know exactly what happened with that, but I would guess that he either had a low draft number, possibly a student deferment, although he only attended college briefly, Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California. It just wasn't for him. But I never did find out why he didn't end up drafted. My supposition would have to be he had a low draft number, and or for actually a high draft number, a number that, the lower the number you had, the more likely you were actually to get drafted. The higher the number, the less likely. So my guess is that he had a high draft number, and that's what happened.
So here we are. We have the Bermans, January 6, 1986, in the Mojave Desert, set out for a little walk. They never returned. Then we find out they've been murdered. So can you set the scene for us? Like the Mojave Desert, California, that's all kind of most of us know about it until I read your book here, the Berman Murders, and it's a fascinating yet almost desolate, quite remote place.
Well, Dennis, I think when people normally conceive of California, they think of beaches or perhaps cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco.
Yes.
But there's a whole part of California that's east of the Sierra Nevada, adjacent to the state of Nevada, that is really like the Wild West and very different from the rest of the state. And there are portions of the Mojave Desert and eastern California that are actually quite remote and difficult to get to. And the place where Barry and Louise ended up, called Saline Valley, is actually one of the more difficult to access locations in the western United States. First of all, you have to go on a 2-lane highway, kind of in the middle of nowhere, as if you're heading to Death Valley. But then from there, you turn onto a dirt road that, when it's passable, and many times in the year, it may wash out, for example, in the flash flooding that occurs in the monsoon season, or in the winter, where it crosses a pass, there may be snowfall and you can't get in. It can actually be very difficult to access. But if you get into Saline Valley, after 50 miles of rugged off-highway driving, you're in this place that it's like untouched by time. It's this pristine desert valley with sand dunes and a silvery saltwater lake. And in the middle of this valley are hot springs, natural hot springs that over the years have been changed by counterculture types into an oasis. The water has been piped into these stone and cement bathing pools, and people hang out, smoke weed, maybe have a drink, usually with no clothes on. But it's not a place of licentiousness, Dennis. It's more of a back to nature kind of spot.
And this is where the Bermans were. They went off for a walk. Now, other people sort of noticed them, and then they noticed that they didn't return. Is that what happened?
Well, that's right. They set out on a morning walk, and they never came back. Some other campers that were camping nearby noticed, hey, this couple didn't return, but nobody thought much of it. They were in their own world. Somebody mentioned it to the fellow who acted as a sort of campground host, a guy named Chili Bob.
Yeah.
Chili as in chili con carne. He was an inveterate beer drinker kind of a guy who just lived out there in a little trailer full time. So eventually he became the campground host. He was the only one who had the means to reach the outside world via any kind of communication device. He had a 2-way radio where he could radio into the sheriff's office. And days after the Bermans failed to return to camp, he reported them missing to the Inyo County, California Sheriff's Office.
Now, I know that the sheriff's office was probably stretched to the limit, not very much resources, many resources, but the way I read it, they didn't seem to take this too seriously. Am I right or wrong?
Well, at the beginning, they didn't. Keep in mind, we're talking about a rural sheriff's department, a
Right.
small, maybe 50 people total, covering a 10,000 square mile area, and a scattered population of only 15,000 people. And actually, most of those people were concentrated in one sort of urbanized area. And out where the Bermans were, as I mentioned, it was just very hard to get in there. So the deputy who was assigned to go in there kind of blew it off. He figured, they'll probably return. Didn't want to necessarily take this long drive for nothing. So he delayed and didn't actually get out there until he was ordered to go in and check it out. And it was a week after the Bermans had vanished when he finally got boots on the ground. And then even after that, it took more time to rally up the search and rescue folks to begin to look for the Bermans and try to figure out what happened to them.
And there was one guy who kind of took it more seriously than the rest, and he was sort of more vested in the case.
Well, it's interesting. That's Leon Boyer. He was a deputy, really a rancher by background, just a part-time deputy, and he happened to be working dispatch when the call came in that the Bermans were missing. And for some reason, it really stuck with him. And even though he wasn't formally trained in investigation, he had enormous, just intuitive investigatory skills. And pretty quickly, he started to realize that something wasn't right. And Dennis, he stuck with the case for years, long after everyone else had forgotten about it.
So the Bermans are missing. They're in the Mojave Desert, as you've said, Inyo County. By the way, how did the Inyo County Sheriff's, how did they get financing in such a sparsely populated area? Is there a big tax base that we don't know about?
Not really. It's just the normal property tax base and the other taxes that are collected by a local government. So they really didn't have funding for this kind of thing. Now, Jules Berman did come out to the scene. He actually chartered a plane, came and brought in a whole entourage, including a psychic, by the way. But they had no luck either in a private search. He even hired an investigator. Nothing. Everybody just came up empty. By the way, the sheriff's office, once they found out that it was a VIP of sorts, that the people who were missing, that Barry was the son of a wealthy, powerful man, I mean, they pulled out the stops. It was the largest search effort that had ever been mounted in Inyo County history, and multiple agencies contributed assets, everybody from the National Guard to the California Highway Patrol, the naval base that was nearby, a lot of boots on the ground, a lot of aerial assets, fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters of various types, and just nothing, Dennis, not a trace. Two people.
Nothing.
No trace.
No trace. So we're talking with Doug Kari about the Berman Murders, a mysterious disappearance in the Mojave Desert. Years go by, nothing happens, and then somebody finds something. What happens next?
What happened next was just happenstance. So out there in this part of the desert and in other areas of the Mojave, there are a lot of mountain ranges. I mean, it's not just open, flat desert. Saline Valley is ringed by rugged mountains. And the Mojave is actually a very rugged and mountainous region. And there are people, and I'll admit to being one of them, who like to go out and climb these remote desert peaks and pride themselves in how many of these remote locations they've been to. And one such fellow, he's never been identified. God knows I've tried. But yeah, he was descending from a peak in the Last Chance Range, which defines the eastern side of Saline Valley, and in a location about 7 rugged miles away from where Barry and Louise had been camping. About 3 years after they disappeared, as he was returning from climbing this peak, he noticed something shining in the sun. It was a human skull. He picked it up, marked the spot, went down, and from the hot springs, a radio call was placed to the sheriff's office. And at that point, the coroner, the district attorney, and sheriff's officials all descended on the scene and found that the Bermans had been killed and their remains had been placed in a shallow grave. And the grave had been somewhat disturbed over time, but they could see that the bodies had been stacked one on top of the other and then concealed with rocks and dirt.
Now, do we have any idea how they were actually killed?
No cause of death. The coroner said that it was indeterminate, but clearly a homicide given all of the circumstances, given their disappearance, the massive search, the fact that most clothing had been stripped from their bodies, shoes had been removed, and they were obviously very carefully concealed with rocks having been gathered and dirt having been put over them. Additionally, with the remains, a handcuff key was found.
So he couldn't have sort of perished by dehydration or thirst or exposure if there's handcuffs lying around, or not lying around, but evidence of handcuffs being involved. So, yeah, it would rule out natural causes, one would think.
One would think, yeah, they didn't they didn't take off their clothes, hide them somewhere, climb into this grave themselves and then bury themselves. Somebody did that, and it only makes sense that they did that to conceal a crime.
So we go back now to January 6, 1986, when they leave on their camping trip, but there's other people around their little spot, like you said, the hot springs. So then we go back and we investigate the people that were there at the time, but any likely suspects appear?
Well, the sheriff's office considered a whole range of possibilities. As far afield as where the Bermans lived in Santa Barbara County, they actually had a property adjacent to Ronald Reagan's ranch. He was the sitting U.S. president, and there was some thinking that perhaps someone had killed them in order to gain access to the property and have a place, a vantage point adjacent to the favorite retreat of the sitting U.S. president. That was just one of many theories that were considered. But obviously the sheriff's office was looking more close to home. Who was out there at the same time as the Bermans? And there weren't very many people. Most of them could be easily eliminated. They were cooperative. It just didn't make sense that it would be them. But there was one fellow, Dennis,
yes,
who seemed suspicious. He was traveling alone. He had made sexual advances to some campers, a couple actually. He had proposed a threesome, and he seemed creepy, and his behavior on the day in question was highly suggestive.
So what we have here is the Berman Murders, a mystery in the Mojave. What drew you to this case? And you've been working at it for a long time. So what spurred your interest?
Well, it was really the location. I had been doing a lot of mountaineering in that area. I loved Saline Valley to the point where one of the steep mountain ranges I told you about actually has canyons in it where there are waterfalls. And all of my kids, we baptized them under one of those waterfalls. I've also been involved in wilderness conservation. I founded a conservation group years ago that was focused on these remote areas of the California desert. All of this ties back to my grandmother, actually. When my grandfather died, she became a prospector. She moved into the middle of the Mojave and lived in a little cabin with kerosene lamps, and she roamed around the desert in a four-wheel drive truck, staking mining claims and gathering relics. So I was always, from the time I was a little boy, just really into the desert. It fired my imagination, and this area in particular was my favorite of all. So when two people just vanished and then later they turned up murdered, I mean, it just kind of cast a pall over the whole vibe out there. You just wouldn't imagine in a place so remote and so peaceful that something like this could happen. And it just was in the back of my mind for years as I pursued a career in law as a lawyer and began to write and do investigative journalism as an avocation. This case stuck in my mind, and finally in 2014 I thought, well, I'm going to start asking questions and just find out what happened. And one thing led to another, and it became a 9-year quest.
And you do have plenty of interviews. How'd you track down these people? Just one phone call after another, basically?
Yeah, one thing led to another, Dennis. It started with a guy that was a longtime mountaineering partner of mine, kind of a wild man, actually, a firefighter who had never agreed to be promoted. He only wanted to spend his career as the first guy off the truck. He's just this solid guy and super bright, the kind of guy who, as you're walking through the desert, he's quoting Shakespeare or Bob Dylan or the Bible or Arthur Miller, and sometimes he would break into songs. He had memorized entire musicals. That's the kind of guy he was. Absolutely brilliant, quirky, crazy, and with a phenomenal memory. And he started listing off some of the people I might want to contact. And then one by one, I started tracking them down. I do have a private investigator I work with who would help me locate people. And I either made phone calls or knocked on doors. And then the sheriff's office agreed they would cooperate and make records available. And it just kind of went from there. But it took a long time and a lot of effort. Obviously, when you're investigating a case from 1986 and you're starting out in 2014, it's tough. And it just requires a lot of patience and persistence.
So now let's jump ahead a little bit here. We have a main suspect after all the investigations and interviews and years go by. Michael Pepe, his name, a former Marine now, and the case takes us from California to Cambodia. How did all that come about? If you can condense that into sort of a elevator pitch.
Yeah, the elevator pitch on it is that despite the circumstantial evidence, both local investigators, the sheriff's office, and federal investigators, because this happened on federal land and he was a Marine Corps captain, they just couldn't put together a case that they thought would stick. There just wasn't enough hard evidence. Everybody felt like Pepe was the guy, but they wouldn't be able to convict. And so ultimately, when he retired from the Marine Corps, he took his Marine pension and his status as a retired Marine Corps officer. He moved to Cambodia, rented a villa, and turned it into a harem of sorts for underage girls that he kept as sex slaves, that he actually would tie up and torture and do all kinds of unmentionable things to, which really, in my mind, as a writer, as an investigator, cast a light on the character of the man and further filled in what might have happened out there with Barry and Louise.
What kind of motive would he have?
Well, the sheriff's office concluded that it was likely a sexual motivation. Listen, Louise was known as kind of a flirt. She had a way with men. She'd been married 4 times. Yep. She'd had many lovers. And there was a little bit of stress between her and Barry. They'd had a rocky year, and in fact, this trip was a makeup trip, but she was always insecure about having a younger husband who was somewhat quiet and aloof. She never quite knew where she stood with him. And one can imagine when they're in a hot tub, sharing a hot tub with Pepe, which they did the night before they disappeared, that there might have been a little bit of, flirting or charming on her part. Very natural and innocent, the kind of thing that a woman might do to just kind of show her husband that she remains attractive in the eyes of men.
Yep.
And Pepe might have well misinterpreted this. And the next day, when he was seen in his little truck leaving in the same direction where they went on a hike, the supposition is that he offered them a ride, and one thing led to another, and there was a fight. And this supposition was ultimately backed up by jailhouse informants who surfaced after Pepe was arrested in Cambodia.
And he is kind of a hot-headed kind of guy, isn't he? To say the least.
Interestingly, he has a very mellow, resonant voice, and apparently he can be quite charming and seems quite relaxed. However, from what his sisters told me, and ultimately I was able to get 2 of his siblings to cooperate with my investigation, there was a part of his personality that was explosive. He could be mellow up to a point and then just flip out. And it's highly likely that's what occurred in this case, that he just flipped on that switch, something happened, and the Bermans ended up dead.
But we can't prove it, and I don't want to give away the rest of the story, so we will leave it at that as a Mojave mystery. But are there other Mojave mysteries out there that worth investigating?
Well, I'm working on several of them, Dennis. In that very same valley where the Bermans disappeared, a few years ago, a Vietnam veteran named Bob Wildner mysteriously disappeared, and his family is quite distraught. The search was not massive. It seemed to be almost perfunctory. Oh, well, he's old. He probably just wandered off. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So actually, I have been investigating that. I've written a couple of articles for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I have found some evidence, and I do have a theory. Another case I'm working on, a book actually, involves a woman who was kidnapped and murdered in northern Nevada. In that case, we know who the perpetrator was. Ultimately, he was caught. However, what I'm diving into is the underpinnings, the why. Why this man who was a middle-aged construction supervisor would do something so dark and terrible.
Doug Kari's been with us. We're talking about the Berman Murders. I encourage everyone, one and all, go out, get the book. It's who's the publisher again? Bowman and Littlefield? Roman and Littlefield.
Roman and Littlefield, and
Yep.
the book is available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, you name it. If you Google the Berman Murders or Doug Kari, my last name is Kari.
Right.
You can find it, and you can also find my website, my Facebook page, Instagram account.
So let's, just before we wrap it up here, Doug, what's that website one more time?
It's just Doug Kari, DougKari.com.
Doug Kari, the author of the Berman Murders. I'm enthralled by this story. I've been haven't almost put it down. Well, I would say I can't put it down because it's glued to my fingers, but that's an old joke from laughing. So we'll leave it at that. And again, Doug, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.